So this is our last class talking about the Transfiguration. We've talked about the Transfiguration as an icon for who Jesus is, and then we looked last week at Moses, whose role in the Transfiguration is representing the law, and now we get Elijah, who is representing the prophets, since Jesus came to fulfill both the law and the prophets. So Elijah is the person who comes up in the Transfiguration to represent all of the prophets. Now, Elijah is a prophet, but I think the big question we might ask is, why is he considered to be the prophet? Especially since Elijah doesn't have a book. A lot of prophets do. Isaiah, Jeremiah, even though he didn't write it, and there's questions about whether there was a prophet Jonah. Jonah's got a book. You've got Hosea and all these other folks, but Elijah does not have a book. He doesn't have his own book as a prophet. Elijah's story, in fact, is actually chronicled in 1st and 2nd Kings, specifically 1st Kings chapters 17 through 19 and chapter 21. We won't go through all of that. And then he also appears again in 2nd Kings from the beginning in chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 12. And we'll read a part of that portion actually this coming Sunday. Our reading is when Elijah is taken up in the chariots of fire. Don't worry, we're not going to read through all of this passage because we would be here for a long time if we did. But that's where we get Elijah's story, not in his own book, but in 1st and 2nd Kings, which are basically the part of the text that covers the history of Israel. So, why is Elijah considered the prophet, at least as far as the Transfiguration is concerned? Well, part of it is because Elijah was considered the prophet in many other ways. He was a prophet legend, we might say. While he's not the first prophet who we hear about, in fact, the first one is in 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 1, he is the first prophet that's named, at least in our chronicle that we get here in 1st and 2nd Kings. So, also we should note too, Elijah isn't the first, or rather he's not the only prophet in his own time as well. In 1 Kings chapter 20, verse 35, we get that there's other prophets that are preaching at this time. We also get the various groups of prophets that are mentioned in 2 Kings, and we'll be hearing about some of those again on Sunday. So it's not that Elijah was the first. It's not that he was the only prophet in his time, but he is the first that's named. This, too, I should make a note. This is concerning prophets during the time of the kings of Israel. There's other folks in different categories that could be considered prophets. For example, the prophet Samuel, who's also one of the judges, the leaders of Israel before the kings. So this is looking specifically at the tradition of prophets during the time of the kings of Israel, the area we tend to focus on when we talk about the prophets themselves. So, again, Elijah, not the first, not the only, but a bit of a legend. And part of this legend that Elijah would take on is chronicled in 1 Kings chapter 18. This is verses 20 through 40, We're not going to read the whole thing. We're just going to read a little bit of this. But basically, for the section we're going to talk about, at this point, the king is Ahab, which you may recognize the name from Moby Dick. You also, Ahab was married to Jezebel, which is a really good name for a villain, and she is very much a villain. Ahab was not considered a good king of Israel, and part of it was because he let his wife do really a lot of, and really anything that she wanted to do, but as far as religion, he allowed her to set up her own religion, following the false god Baal. And so Baal has its own set of prophets, and there's basically this face-off, kind of for Israel's soul, in a sense. Which god are they going to follow? Are they going to follow Baal? Or are they going to follow the God of Israel? And this challenge is they set up two different altars. They each of the groups of prophets has their, the prophets of Baal and Elijah each have their own sacrifices, and they each call upon their God to light this sacrifice. So before this, the prophets of Baal have failed, and so Elijah, it's now his turn after they've failed. So this is starting in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come closer to me." And all the people came closer to him. First, he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. Then he made a trench around the altar, large enough to contain 2 measures of seed. Next, he put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. He said, "Fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." Then he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. Again, he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time, so that the water ran all around the altar and filled the trench also with water. So just pausing here for a second, the point of this is that this is going to be really hard to light because there's so much water on it. So not only is Elijah showing them that God can do the impossible, he's also showing that God can do it even with it being a more seemingly impossible task. All right, so we're going to continue back up on 1 Kings 18:36. At the time of the offering of the oblation, the prophet Elijah came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." And the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord indeed is God. The Lord indeed is God." Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." They seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Wadi Kishon and killed them there. So a little bit of a violent end. Also, we should note that Israel may have turned around for a while, and they may have remembered this story, but of course they fell into their own ways again and started following their own ways and not God's after this. So it was unfortunately a short-lived success. But the point of this was to prove that God is the one true God. And again, like we'll see with other prophets, when giving the people irrefutable proof, oftentimes they're not listened to. Another thing as part of the legend of Elijah is he has a following. He is succeeded by another prophet, Elisha, which I'm going to try to emphasize that a little bit because the funny thing with this is that Elijah and Elisha sound very, very similar, but they're not the same person. Elisha follows Elijah. And as we'll hear about on Sunday in our gospel, or our Old Testament lesson there, Elisha actually ends up receiving twice a double share of Elijah's spirit. That's what he asked Elijah for. So Elijah fits in the bill as a prophet, not only because of his epic story countering the prophets of Baal, but also because he was a teacher. He had someone who succeeded him. And this is true of other prophets as well. Isaiah, for instance, the book of Isaiah, many scholars will tell you is in two parts. Some will even say three. I tend to lean towards the three. So that Isaiah isn't just one prophet giving all these teachings. It's a school of prophets following this first prophet, Isaiah. And then you've got second Isaiah, who is a prophet in the same tradition after the exile of the Israelites. And then you've got third Isaiah at the very end of the book, who's a prophet following the return of the Israelites into Israel. So, again, epic challenge, and he's a teacher. So Elijah has got some things going for him as being considered the prophet, and especially the prophet to represent the prophets in the Transfiguration. Another reason that I would say he's the prophet that's there for the Transfiguration is because of his connection with the Messianic tradition, with the leading into Messiah, the Messiah coming. The first place we see this is in 2 Kings in chapter 1, verse 8, and I'll read this. And this is the description that's given of Elijah, is that he was a hairy man with a leather belt around his waist. And also he spends a great time in the wilderness too. We hear this at various spots. We hear of the spot, which we'll talk about in a little bit, when he goes off to Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai as it's also called, to listen to God there. So the reason I mention both these two things is because this is very similar to the description of John the Baptist. At the very beginning of Mark 1, verse 6, we get this description of John the Baptist. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and honey. So again, we get that leather belt around his waist. So the description of them is similar. Both are in the wilderness a lot. We can kind of compare both of them to each other. That comparison is very important because of what we hear with the prophet Malachi. So Malachi is one of the final prophets, His book is the last book of prophecy that in our ordering of the Old Testament. So I'm going to read from Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 through 6. And again, I should mention all of these verses I'm reading from are from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. So Malachi 4, 5 through 6. Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of parents to their children, and the hearts of children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse. So, because of this reading in the Old Testament, this led to the belief that Elijah would come before Messiah came, which was, of course, supposed to be the end of days, was his coming. This has led to a couple of things. If you've ever been to a Seder meal for Passover, they always leave a place open for Elijah. In fact, if you have any Jewish friends, they will tell you that you're really not supposed to name your kid Elijah, because the idea that when Elijah comes, the Messiah will come after. So it's, one, you're putting a great burden on that child, and it's also a little arrogant to say, oh yeah, my child is going to be the person that helps bring in Messiah. So the lesson be, don't name your child Elijah. So this idea too that Elijah is the precursor for Messiah, we see this in the New Testament as well, because some people thought that John the Baptist was Elijah, which again is why we get this description, why they sound very similar to each other. And so now turning to Matthew, this is chapter 17, verse 10 through 13, which we'll be noting in just a moment is right after the Transfiguration. So Matthew 17, 10 through 13. And the disciples asked Jesus, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He replied, "Elijah is indeed coming and will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him. But they did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. Now, this is one thing. On the other hand, at the beginning of John, in John chapter 1, verse 21, John the Baptist is asked if he's Elijah, and he replies, "I am not." So we get kind of this confusion. Is John the Baptist Elijah? Is he coming in the spirit of Elijah? We don't know. The Transfiguration itself could be seen as dealing with this difficulty, because it could be that this is representing Elijah's return. So we get both in Mark chapter 9, verses 9 through 13, as well as the passage we just read in Matthew, Matthew 17, 10 through 13. These passages where Jesus says that Elijah has already come. And I read the passage from Matthew because it's got that little bit at the end that says the disciples understood he was talking about John the Baptist. But it is interesting, both of these conversations come after the Transfiguration, and both discuss Elijah coming before Messiah. So is it that John the Baptist represents Elijah and Elijah's coming? Is it that it's actually Elijah's physical presence there in the Transfiguration that is before Messiah's coming, or at least it heralds in Messiah's coming. We don't know. Either way, we're covered. Elijah's come first, and Messiah's come after. So that's another reason I think that Elijah is chosen as the representative of the prophets for the Transfiguration. The last reason is Elijah has this connection with the law. And I alluded to this earlier. So in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 18, which I won't read right now, this tells the story of Elijah's flight into the wilderness. So this is after his victory over the prophets of Baal. He's really ticked Jezebel off, and you don't want to tick a queen off, particularly a powerful one who's going to do whatever she wants, who's also a villain. So she starts to go after Elijah, and so he flies away into the wilderness. And in 1 Kings 19, verse 8, Elijah ends up at Horeb. And as I said before, Mount Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. This is where Moses received the law, which is a fitting connection that both Moses and Elijah would receive a statement from God on this same mountain. Because the prophets are really a continuation of the law. Because both are really calling us to live a better life in relationship with God as well as with each other. That's the summary of the law that we say every Sunday. The two great commandments: love God with all your heart, with all your soul and your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. That's the summary of the law, but that's also the summary of what the prophets are saying. So it's really fitting that Sinai becomes the place where both where both the law and the message to the prophet Elijah are received. The Transfiguration itself recalls both Moses and Elijah receiving the word of God on a mountain. Because while this mountain isn't Sinai, which is outside of Israel, it's on a mountain that the Transfiguration occurs. So it's reflecting this aspect of Mount Sinai being where both the law and the prophets are received. And again, this gets at Jesus' role of fulfilling both the law and the prophets, completing all of the teachings that have come before. So again, summing this all up, why is Elijah chosen to be the one to represent the prophets in the Transfiguration? Part of it's his own merits. He was a legend as a prophet. Part of it's the prophecies given, the messianic connection, that he's supposed to come before Messiah. And we see that play out too in the similarities between himself and John the Baptist. And we also see, I also believe that he's the person here representing the prophets because in the Transfiguration, because of his connection with the law itself too, that both he and Moses received the word of God on Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, depending on what you want to call it and who you're talking to. So, and again, because of this, because of all these things, because of the connection with Moses and because of the messianic prophecies, Elijah's place here really helps complete the sense that the Transfiguration is this icon, this image of Jesus fulfilling both the law and the prophets. So that's it for this class. Thank y'all for coming.